Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the double album from Xanthochroid called Of Erthe And Axen, Acts 1 and 2. So here's one of the little benefits that comes with working in genres like black metal. Given that you have no real obligation to fit a radio sound or song structures or topics, you can pretty much write about whatever the hell you want, and audience will typically be pretty receptive for it. Now granted, there are certain themes that have been present in black metal for some time now, and you typically want to work in similar territory to avoid being branded as a gimmick, or maybe just fit more with the sound, but you do have a little bit more wiggle room than your average overmanaged pop or country or hip-hop act. And into this scene comes the American progressive black metal band Xanthochroid, who broke out in the early 2010s with an EP and a debut record in 2012, but actually ended up gaining some more traction and notoriety thanks to a couple of covers they put up on YouTube of acts like, say, Winter Sun or Opeth. But if you only know them through the covers, you're missing out a more ambitious band. One in the grand tradition of metal groups has constructed an ongoing story arc behind each of their albums that seemed at least kind of interesting to me. They also seem to have a bit of a sense of humor, and they also made all their lyrics readily available online, so I was definitely curious to check out that debut record from 2012, and, well, it certainly was ambitious, that's for damn sure. It's also, like a lot of the black metal that I've covered this year, pretty far away from the conventional sound in the genre, utilizing extensive clean vocals that for me can be kinda hit and miss, overdubbed male choirs, acoustic sections, organ, and even flutes that sounded pretty damn good. And given the focus on building more of the grand narrative of their story, I was almost certain that they'd probably wind up closer to power metal or symphonic metal eventually, but not just yet, because 5 years after that debut album, they have a double album follow-up. The first disc released in mid-August, and the second one that came out just this week. And again, double albums can be kinda tricky, and while I was convinced that Xanthochroid could bring enough ideas to the table, it was still likely to be pushing it, probably be a little bit too ambitious. So okay, what do we find of on Erthe And Axen, Acts 1 and 2? Oh boy! Okay, this is gonna be one of those tougher reviews for me to get through, not only because this double album is pretty damn massive to really pick apart and deconstruct, but also because, just like Aeon's The Source from earlier this year, it's a prequel to an established story with the sort of lore and density that I'm sure will be right up so many people's alley. The thing is that as a critic, particularly one who is a fantasy author himself, there's a part of me that wants to review both the lore and the music, because there's also a part of me that's unconvinced that this all holds together as much as I would otherwise like. I do think it's pretty damn good, but I'm not quite sure it's great. And to explain all this, I think I'd like to start with the lyrics and the writing on this record, and an acknowledgement that even if you've been able to follow the narrative across their last two projects, to really make heads or tails of the entire arc of the story, Xanthochroid has attached fully illustrated listening guides of their albums that show how the lyrics tell some of that story. Now, already I've got a bit of an issue with this, and it's one that I have talked about before when it comes to these sort of narrative-driven records. If you need additional writing to explain a self-contained narrative, which the album should be, you haven't really told a self-contained narrative. The songwriting should be enough here. We didn't even get character names referenced in the lyrics, and while I will give credit to vaguely distinctive enough vocals to represent the different figures, in both the growl and the scream vocals and the clean vocals, and the inclusion of Ali Meter for the female vocals to make them all seem distinctive, at some point, you run the risk of being too abstracted in order to follow the plot here. And sure, that does kind of fit the style of a lot of progressive and black metal writing, but you unfortunately build some distance with the audience if you need auxiliary material in order to follow what you're trying to say. Now granted, the arc of this story as a whole is very reminiscent of The Brothers' War by Jeff Grubb, arguably the best Magic the Gathering novel that's not written by Scott McGough, but again, it's a prequel, and the choice to split said prequel into two parts requires some pretty weird shifts in the narrative. And while I get and appreciate that the entire story indulges in some morally ambiguous framing, I do question whether or not it was a good idea to have a certain character engage in heroic sacrifice near the end of the first disc, and thus rob the album of that distinct voice for the vast majority of the second. Other characters could have been killed to raise the stakes. It did not need to be that person. But honestly, the entire story as a whole feels a bit overplotted, if that makes any sense, setting up so much that has to be in place for the existing records that come later that the plot turns that are expected to carry the emotional weight can feel, well, a little bit rushed, not quite given the same room to resonate or hold their impact. And a big part of this also ties back to the structure. As I mentioned at the very beginning, black and progressive metal can play fast and loose with this, but One of the frustrating things about this double album is that it's hard for any one song to stand out as a self-contained piece. Let's go back to Erthe as the best example. While you do understand the entire narrative, you do need the full record. Arian Lucassen always makes the effort to have most individual songs capable of just standing alone with a defined hook, which makes the individual tracks ultimately add up to more. Whereas here, when you consider you need outside lore to understand the story, and many of the songs do not feel self-contained, you get the exact opposite feeling. And that's incredibly frustrating for me because for the most part, I really love the sound and style of this album. The drum work is flat out incredible. The acoustic movements have real personality and poise, especially when supplemented by a lot of the flutes. The clean singing is often very potent and shows real harmonic interplay in the choral vocal arrangements. Not quite as fun personally as some of the screaming. I'm not sure it's got the power that it truly needs, but I appreciate the effort. And more often than not, the guitar work, tremolo or otherwise, is flat out nuts. By far, Xanthochroid is a group that can really play. And their choice to accent black metal textures with more progressive and even symphonic touches, it's daring, but for the most part actually sticks the landing. From the more sweeping symphonic touches of the first disc to the darker callbacks to their debut with bringing in some of the organ. And there are so many potent moments here. The gorgeous orchestration that opens up the album with Open the Gates, O Forest Keeper, the acoustic and electric guitar solos anchoring songs like Of God's Bereft of Grace, the higher climbs where few might, and Towards Truth and Reconciliation, the explosive male choirs on Walk With Me, O Winged Mother that erupt into phenomenal blast beat drumming, some great bass simmer and strings accented atmosphere on Two Souls, Distant and Dreaming. That's before the acoustic solo that ends the song just perfectly timed there, the amazingly dense a cappella song through Caverns, Old and Yawning, the tremendous symphonic drama of The Sound of Hunger Rises, and of course, the flutes. Whenever they show up, they're just so well poised in that mix. They sound so good. But what's important to stress here, these are moments. They're not exactly whole songs, and without a lot of the crescendos, and outside of the quieter ballads like To Love in Ancient Gardens, and especially The Sound of a Glinting Blade, probably the best standalone song here, many of these tracks only really develop that cinematic weight within the sweep of the record, which is potent, sure, but it can kinda hurt some of the replay value as a whole. But honestly, what of Erthe and Axen Acts 1 and 2 remind me of most is the last Dream Theater album, The Astonishing. Another double album with an overdeveloped narrative that doesn't really feel like it's adding up to more. But granted, Of Erthe and Axen has its strengths over that album. The production and composition is more organic, a fair bit more diverse. The harmonies are even more layered, and again, I can't stress how much the diversity of vocal tones helps the flow of the narrative and does provide some characters. But at the same time, The Astonishing had individual songs like a standalone, and for the most part, you could actually kind of follow the story, even if it did feel cliched. And look, I really do appreciate Xanthochroid's ambition here. This is a band with tremendous chops and the sort of cinematic vision that consistently aims high. It's clear this is a labor of love. You understand why this took 5 years. But perhaps a tighter focus on structural level might bring this to the heights that it really deserves, because while I think this is damn good, it's just not quite great for me, I gotta be honest. As such, I'm giving it an extremely strong 7 out of 10, definitely a recommendation. This is a band with tremendous talent and ambition I would love to see get even bigger and better, because at least with this, they're definitely on that path, just not all the way there yet. But still, you want to check this out. Trust me on that. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I was going to cover this back when the first act came out, but I actually spoke with the patron who asked for this, and he said you could talk about both of them at once. Good thing I did. If you guys want to get involved in that Patreon, the link to that is right over there, where you got, or 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you get to add records, movies, or even top 10 lists to that schedule, and you guys are really taking advantage of that, I gotta be honest. Beyond that, if you guys want to buy the record, links in the description below, and I highly recommend you do. You want to support bands like this with this sort of ambition. And I got the poll up there for all you die-hard Xanthochroid fans to tell me how wrong I am. Again, I want to like this a little bit more. I think a little bit more structure could have probably gotten us there. But, till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.